This will be a tutorial for chapters 69 through 75 of A Smarter Way to Learn JavaScript. This will cover objects, object properties, methods, constructors, and prototypes. The goal of this tutorial will be to create a program to track student classes and grades. It will use objects to organize it so that more students can easily be added later on. We'll start with just 3 students, Chris, Tim, and Hannah. Your first thought might be to make variables for each student for each class they're in and assign integers for the grades. This is kind of messy, as we'll see here in Sublime. So what we have in this first example is variables for each student in each class they're in. For example, for Chris, we have his English grade, his math grade, his history grade, and his science grade. And we have the same sort of thing for Tim and Hannah, and each of these variables is equal to the integer for the grade they got in the class. So this is a bit messy, having 4 variables for each student that isn't really attached to that student in any way. See, you and I can see that their names are at the beginning of each of these variables. So you have Chris English grade, Tim English grade, Hannah English grade, but in terms of the program, they aren't grouped together in any specific way. So I'll show you how to do that later on using objects. What we have now is their starting point. We've just our regular variables, and we're referring to them by name to place them in this text box. For this second example, I've made each student into their own object. So what we have here is an object called Chris and its associated properties, which are like the variables from earlier, except they're belonging to the object that is Chris. So Chris has an English grade, math grade, history grade, and science grade. And they're declared somewhat like the variables from earlier, except they're going to use a colon instead of an equal sign, and a comma to end the line instead of a semicolon, because the semicolon is actually going to go after the brackets that encapsulate all of the different properties. So once again, we have an English grade belonging to Chris, a math grade belonging to Chris, and so on. So how are we going to address them? How are we going to call them? So we're going to use something called dot notation. So Chris.EnglishGrade is how we're going to insert the English grade into our text. So this means that we're going to find the English grade that is associated with Chris. And we're going to do the same sorts of things for Tim and Hannah. So here we have English grade that is belonging to Hannah. So there's a few other things that you can do using properties. Some things you can't do using variables. So first I'm going to load this up in a browser. You can see that it's going to display very similarly to what we had before. And then let's uncomment this. So what this does is it's deleting the English grade that belongs to Tim. Maybe Tim dropped the class, or maybe he just had too busy of a schedule or conflicted, so either way, he doesn't have an English grade anymore. And this is going to delete the variable or the property entirely. So we have English undefined for Tim. And maybe we don't want to display like that, so what we're going to have is we can actually change the English grade, kind of like we can change a variable after the fact. So we have tim.EnglishGrade equals W, and this should override what he has up here and make it equal to W. And what else we have is, you'll notice I have had Hannah.ScienceGrade equals 72 here this whole time. And so what I'm actually doing is I'm adding a science grade for Hannah that she doesn't have listed up here. Maybe she added the class late, or maybe she took it somewhere else and it was just added after the fact. But either way, we're adding the science grade not in the object declaration, but after. So you can see English equals W, and then Hannah's science grade has been showing up. So, good for Hannah. I've made some modifications to Chris, Tim, and Hannah's objects. What I've done is I've added a function called avcalc. Now when a function is attached to an object, it's actually called a method. So this is the method avcalc, but it's defined very similarly to functions you see elsewhere. It opens and closes using brackets, and you can hand it parameters. For example, this receives a parameter that becomes the value cutoff that's used to determine whether or not the average value for someone's grade is above or below the cutoff for passing or failure. So what this does is it determines their average grade based on all their classes, this dot English grade, this dot math grade, all of those, adds them together, divides them by total classes to get the average, and then it returns it and whether or not they pass. So when you call this function, it's going to return their average grade, and then a space, and then you pass or you fail. So how is this called? It's actually called very similarly to how you would call the properties. It's just chris.avcalc, and then you can't forget to send it that parameter value, which in this case is 65. So what we have in this example is something called a constructor. Now, a constructor is a way to make new objects using essentially one line, but it's based off a set of instructions that come before it. So for example, we have variable Chris equals new student, and then all the information about Chris's grades. So what it's doing is it's going to the set of instructions called student, and it's inserting these as parameters. So if I go up here to student, so this 84 here is becoming English, and it's setting the English grade for Chris, so this dot English grade is equal to the 84 that I just handed it. And it's doing the same thing for math, history, and science. Once again, say the 76 for the math grade becomes this variable math, and Chris.math grade becomes equal to math, whatever I just handed it being that 76. And then we have the avcalc, the function that we had before, the method that we had before. So what this means is that Chris, Tim, and Hannah can be constructed using the set of instructions within student. So that means that all students can be constructed the same way, and you don't have to re-enter all the different instructions for how to create a new student. You just have to hand it the different values that will be associated with it. And the good part about this is not only do you not have to write this out every time for each student, you can also reference it or call it in the same way using Chris.EnglishGrade, Chris.Math. Nothing about that changes. You do the same as before, but it's a cleaner code, and you don't have to type it all out. At this point in the tutorial, I'm going to go over how to make a prototype. What a prototype does is it creates a method or a property to be shared by all objects made using the same constructor. So what we have is we have Chris, an object, created using a student constructor. We have Tim and Hannah made the same way. They're using a constructor or a set of instructions to make a student type object. They just handed in the different parameters they need, and they make all the different properties using the student constructor, or the set of instructions. So now what we're going to do is we're going to make the prototype avcalc. And this is the same function we had before, but instead of each student being created using a constructor, so it creates all their properties and it creates that function, we're going to have the prototype as the single function that all of these share. Because it's the same, so it's just too much work to make it over and over again. So having them share it is very easy. You're just going to do student, which is the name of their constructor, dot prototype, dot avcalc, which is the name of the method. And then we're going to set it up just like a normal function. Except we have to remember that because it's technically a method or a property, we have to end it with the closing bracket and the semicolon. For the last part of this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to check if an object has a certain property associated with it, and how to make a list of the properties it does have. So what we have so far is we have the student constructor used to make objects that follow the student pattern, like Chris, Tim, and Hannah. They make a new object using the student constructor, and they hand in different values for their grades, and they assign them to the different properties. And then we also have the student.prototype avcalc, which calculates the averages for each of these students and is a shared method between all these objects. So what I've done here is I've reworked the avcalc method. That way it works for students with more or less than 4 classes. I've done this because Tim doesn't have 4 classes. He's dropped English, so we've deleted his English grade. This doesn't really work with our older version, because what we're doing is we're adding the English grade, math grade, history grade, and science grade, and dividing by 4. And that's a problem, because Tim only has 3 classes, so we need to divide by 3, and when we try to add the English grade, we're going to have an error, because his is undefined. This reworking of this method should account for that, because what it's doing is it's making a list of the properties that this object has, the student has. So it's listing all the classes that are associated with them. So for Tim, we've deleted his English grade, so it should only come up with 3. And then grade sum is adding all the values for the different grades together, and the average value is dividing the grade sum by the length of the list of classes. So it's the total grades divided by the number of classes they have, which should give us the average. And then finally we have the pass variable to print out whether they pass or fail. I'm going to go over these 2 for loops first. So say Chris is the one calling this, Chris.avcalc. It's saying for anything in Chris, anything associated with Chris. This var prop here is just really a dummy variable for just any given thing associated with this being Chris, the object that is calling this method. And so what it's doing is it's adding all of Chris's properties to the list of properties using the push method. So essentially a list of properties has just become English, math, science, history. Whereas if it was Tim, it would be math, science, history, because he doesn't have an English class. What this line in between is doing is it's limiting this list to only things that belong directly to Chris, not things made using prototypes. Because if we were to include things using prototypes, avcalc itself would be added to this list of properties, and you'd get English, math, history, science, and avcalc. And we don't want that, so we use this if statement to exclude that. So what the second for loop is doing is it's saying that for anything in Chris, for any property associated with Chris, and only Chris, not one of the prototypes, but one of the things that Chris started out with as the object, we're going to add its value to grade sum. So what it's going to do is it's going to find the English grade value, math grade value, history grade value, and science grade value, and add them all together. And then finally, average value is going to be equal to the sum of all these grades divided by the amount of classes, or the number of indexes in the list of classes. And then we have the same if-else statement to determine if you pass or fail. So if the average value is more than the cutoff, you pass. If it's less, you fail. And then we're going to print the average value to fixed to 2 decimal places. That's what that does. It's going to show it to 2 decimal places, no more, no less. So if it's 78.5, you're going to get 78.50. And then space, do you pass or fail? And then it's going to print the number of classes. That way I can demonstrate for you that this is definitely working. The list of properties.length is going to show you the number of classes that your average was divided by. So let me open this up in a browser. So we have our grades, and we have NA for Tim in English, and it knows that it only has 3 classes, and of course he failed anyway, so probably not much of a help that we specified he had 3 classes. But anyway, we know that it's working, and so that's how we're using these different for loops to make lists. Thanks for watching. This was my explanation of objects, object properties, methods, constructors, and prototypes. I hope it was helpful.